Thank you for playing the Reacting to the Past game, Engines of Mischief. This PowerPoint is intended to give instructors and players historical background needed to play the game. More details can be found in the game book. There also are other PowerPoints that will help players with arguments they can make in Town Hall and with the worksheets they must fill out in the Marketplace section of the game. You can find them on YouTube using the phrase Engines of Mischief in quotation marks. Don't forget that Engines of Mischief is about the Industrial Revolution in Manchester, England in 1817 and 1818. The simplest explanation of what the Industrial Revolution was is that it involved a change from making goods by hand in a person's home to the manufacturing of them with machines in a factory. This change first began in the textile industry, at first in wool and silk, and then most extensively using cotton. This change first occurred in northern England, in the British Isles. Manchester was the heart of the new industrial economy. The Industrial Revolution was not a revolution in the sense that it happened quickly or overnight. It took a long time for England to become a fully industrial nation. Our game is set in the middle of the slow takeoff or beginning period. The fact that something new was happening was apparent to everyone. Factories and machines were common in Manchester, but no one yet really knew what would happen, if the machines in industrial production would take over completely or fade away. In a sense, it's very much like the time period we are living in today, with the new technology of automation and artificial intelligence. Certainly things are changing, but we don't know how much or how fast they will change, and if the result will be positive or negative, or perhaps there'll be something in between. We have to adjust to these new changes, just like people did in Manchester in 1817 and 1818. The players in our game are those people who were very much involved in the new industrial changes. They included middle-class business owners who had businesses in the hand production of textiles, but who then decided to use machines in open factories. We have craftsmen who invented new machines. We have weavers and spinsters who made textile by hand and had to make a choice of whether to enter factories. And we have aristocrats who ran the government and had to decide whether to embrace the new technology or not. The farmers who grew agricultural crops are mostly missing from the game, but they are in the background as potential new residents of the cities who might look for factory jobs. Now a bit more on how the Industrial Revolution began. Before the Industrial Revolution, cotton textiles were made in the cottage industry or the home textile production industry. There are three main steps to making textiles. First, the cotton has to be washed and carded to take out the seeds and lengthen the fibers. Then the raw cotton has to be spun into thread, and then the thread is woven into cloth. This was all done in a family's home or cottage. A merchant would come to the cottage once a week with the raw cotton. They would pick up cloth that was finished the previous week and pay the family a wage. Then the family turned that week's raw cotton into cloth. In most cases, the washing and carding was done by the women and children. Women did the spinning, men did the weaving because it required more physical strength, although it was possible for men and women to do any of these jobs. By the end of the 18th century, there was an increased demand for textiles. It became in the interest of all textile producers to find ways to increase production, to make more cloth with the same number of people in less time. This inspired the inventions of new machines to maximize production. At first, these machines were powered by humans and were small enough to be kept in a home or a cottage. This included the flying shuttle that made it easier and faster to weave, the spinning jenny that enabled one spinner to produce many more spools of thread with the same amount of effort and time, and the cotton engine or cotton gin that made it easier to card the raw cotton. For a good video of all of these processes and how these new inventions helped them, click on the YouTube link below. To speed up production even more, people began to think of ways to provide more power than humans or animals were capable of. First, water wheels on flowing rivers were used to turn an axle that was attached to machines that spun thread, such as the water spinning frame. Then a steam engine was invented that did not need the power of flowing water but could be placed anywhere. Coal was burned to boil water and produce steam. The heating and cooling of the steam turned an axle attached to a wheel that powered other machines. But steam engines were large and dangerous and could not be used in a home or a cottage. This inspired the creation of factories that housed big machines. In Manchester, some factories were converted warehouses used previously to store goods. But now the worker has to leave their homes and travel to be near the machines, and they worked with many other people who were not their family members alone. And now new machines were made for weaving and spinning that were powered by steam engines. The engines moved the wheels and the belt that made the machines operate. They were large, but many of them could be used, and much more cloth can be made in the same time with fewer workers as a result. Eventually, steam engines were used to power steam railways and ships that could move the raw material much more quickly to the factories and the finished products to the potential buyers. They also could move people around the country and the world. This really made the Industrial Revolution take off. With the expansion of steam-powered transportation, the Industrial Revolution was almost complete. It was easier and cheaper to move industrial goods around the country and to the rest of the world, where buyers could be found for the machine-made products that were much cheaper to buy because they were produced in such large quantities at lower costs. But the change in the way goods were made eventually led to some major changes in other things, in lifestyle and society. Some of the key changes that followed the Industrial Revolution included that there were more people around and more people were moving from the countryside into the cities. So by 1850, Britain's population, 50% of Britain's population lived in cities. Societies also changed as the middle classes grew in size and wealth, and as a new type of worker was created, the proletariat, or industrial factory worker. This means that work changed for very, very many people, where they were working in the factories away from their families as opposed to their homes, but also lifestyle changed for everyone. There were new and cheaper products that everyone could afford and that didn't require as much skilled labor. This brings up a controversy that has occupied historians for years. Was the Industrial Revolution a blessing because of the opportunities it offered for the majority of the population to lead a better lifestyle? Or was it a curse because of the destruction of traditional ways of living and work, because it created new inequality and forms of exploitation, and because of the damage it caused to the environment? This debate is hardly over, but most historians today think that what was good or bad about the Industrial Revolution differed according to whether you consider the early period or the later period, when some of the worst abuses were addressed, and which people you are thinking about. Those in the old economy or the new economy, those in the upper, middle, or working classes. Certainly workers who did traditional jobs, like the hand production of textiles, as the weavers and spinsters in our game do, didn't do particularly well in the early Industrial Revolution. Before the extensive use of machines, weavers and spinsters had a nice lifestyle in their cottages. In Manchester, they typically had 3 floors and a basement, with the attic being used to spin and weave cloth by hand, and the rest of the family occupying the rest of the home. Textile production was a skilled profession that required training. In fact, at one time, it was part of the guild system in which workers controlled the trade and took care of one another. Although the guild system was long gone, in 1817, hand weavers and spinsters still had a great deal of independence. They set their own hours and were able to care for their families as they worked. But with the increased use of machines, wages and living conditions declined considerably. Factory production lowered the price at which cloth was sold because it was cheaper to make. In Manchester, in the decade before our game begins, wages of hand weavers and spinsters were reduced in half, from 20 shillings a week to 10 shillings, because the merchants who employed the weavers and spinsters were getting less money for selling the cloth and making less profit, and so they reduced wages. Now the weavers and spinsters were suffering seriously because they made so little money. Some weavers and spinsters were so upset at their economic decline that they engaged in collective actions of violence to try to get higher wages. They used the age-old method of negotiation by riot at first. This is what the lower classes resorted to in difficult times, including the French Revolution, including staging bread riots or attacking people and things that workers thought were harming their traditional economic well-being. Starting in the first decade of the 19th century, the most infamous method to resist the changes of industrialization was that of the Luddites. Under the command of a fictitious General Ludd, workers would send threatening letters to merchants who were using machines and disguise themselves in the middle of the night to destroy the machines and burn down factories. They hoped this would make business owners rely on them and raise their wages and think twice before adopting the new technology. In this picture, the leader of the Luddites is disguised as a woman, and he's commanding a group of workers to attack and burn down a factory. The government was unwilling to tolerate this. Luddites were discovered using a network of spies, and rewards for information about them were given if that information led to their arrest and their jail. If they were put in jail, if they were arrested and put on trial, they could be transported to Australia, or they could suffer execution. The title of our game comes from a song by supporters of the Luddites. Here, General Ludd is considered a modern Robin Hood, breaking the law to help the starving poor. The Luddites claim not to be violent people. They're unused to measures of violence, but they were forced to attack the machines by such severe suffering. They don't want to hurt people, but only the machines, the wide frame weaving machines that are taking away their wages and jobs. These machines they considered engines of mischief, and it is those machines that all the members of the trade of weavers have condemned to death. General Ludd is merely the executioner of the criminal machines that are harming people. If the hand weavers and spinsters suffered at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so too did many of those who worked in factories. Factory work was much different than working at home. There was less independence working for a stranger as a boss who set rules and punishments for breaking rules. The work was unskilled, so more boring and with less job satisfaction. With no government regulation, business owners didn't spend money on comfort or safety of workers, so factories were dirty, dangerous, and noisy. A good visual depiction of an early factory in the Industrial Revolution is in the series North and South, based on the novel by Elizabeth Gaskell. This 2-minute clip that is linked here is a good depiction of the noise and the dirt of a factory, as well as the punishments that factory workers could suffer at the hand of their employers. Factory work was particularly difficult for women, who factory workers liked to employ because of their docility and willingness to work for lower wages. Women could not care for their families the way they did in hand production, and often had to do a second shift to do the housework after a full day of work at the factory. Young women from the countryside didn't have the watchful eye of a community to make sure that they got married if they got pregnant, and if they did get pregnant, they would often lose their jobs in factories and would have to rely on prostitution to survive. Factory owners also liked to employ obedient and cheap children who worked the same hours and the same conditions as adults, often without the supervision of their parents. But some workers did like the new industry. They did actually like to move to cities like Manchester and take jobs in factories. This is especially true of adults, and it is especially true of farm laborers. Farm labor was physically very demanding and had to be done despite bad weather. Factory work was easier inside and provided more regular and steady pay. In fact, in the early Industrial Revolution, to attract workers into factories, owners paid higher wages than they did to hand workers. In the beginning of our game, weavers and spinsters can earn twice as much if they choose to give up their independence and work in a factory. Living conditions in the new industrial cities also could be terrible in the early period, as this contemporary description makes clear. The cities had grown up without government or private provision for clean water, sewage, or garbage collection. Burning coal for steam engine produced black, toxic, foul-smelling fumes. Garbage and industrial byproducts polluted the water. Overcrowding and filth meant that disease was always present. But there were many benefits to the Industrial Revolution, particularly to those classes above the working class, especially the middle classes. And eventually, many of the early problems were solved, and all the classes took advantage of the benefits of industrialization, which included more economic opportunities, higher real wages, as wages paid in factories grew, but prices for factory-produced goods fell. There was more social mobility, more variety in goods, lifestyle, entertainment, and also more physical mobility. But all of this was not necessarily the case in the early Industrial Revolution. All of this happened eventually over the course of the 19th century and with government help. But our game is set in the early Industrial Revolution. Most of the initial problems were still very much present. It was a difficult time of transition, and no one was sure what would happen. The goal of all the players in the game is to make sure that this transition works well, for themselves as individuals, for their social class, and for the British nation as a whole. However, there were certain economic and political features of this period in Britain that had to be taken into consideration by people of all social classes as they attempted to make this transition work. First, and perhaps most important, overshadowing this period of the early Industrial Revolution was the fact that Britain was at war with France on and off for over 20 years. The war started because the British opposition to the French Revolution and determination not to allow it to spread to their country. And then with Napoleon, the expanding French Empire posed a serious threat to British power and autonomy. The wars with France had a serious impact on the British economy and on all players in our game. In many ways, the wars with France helped the British textile industry, both hand production and industrial production. This is because of changes in supply and demand. There was an increased demand for textiles at this period during the war because of the large armies. But then, after the French and British decided to prohibit trade between the combatants and their allies, the British could no longer purchase continental textiles. So the supply of textiles from abroad fell. The British had now to make more textiles of their own. All of this led to an increase in the prices for textiles that were paid, and the domestic textile industry expanded to meet this increased demand and also to profit from the increased prices. And in order to expand the industry, business owners raised the wages of hand producers so that they would make more, but at the same time, they increased the use of machines. This led to what is known as the Golden Age of cotton cloth production. More and more hand weavers and spinsters had to work, and they did work because their wages were higher. As this quote from a contemporary indicates, there was such a demand for fabric that loom shops were rising up everywhere, and the price of labor, the wages, increased tremendously, even as high as 120 shillings a week from about 20 shillings a week. But machine production also expanded at this time period. New inventions were made to maximize production so supply could match demand, and also to maximize profits. First, the machines were for hand production, And then this encouraged the use of steam power machine in factories. But then the wars with France ended, as did the blockade. So there was now free trade. And again, this changed supply and demand. Demand fell because there were no armies. Supply rose because with free trade, it was possible to sell European textiles in Britain, and they generally were made at lower prices than British textiles, so they tended to be cheaper than the British textiles. The results of this was that the prices paid for textiles fell, as did the profits of textile producers. And what this encouraged them to do is to use even more machines and factories to save costs and keep prices low so that they could compete. The British producers could compete with continental producers. At the same time, there was an increased supply of foreign workers who were willing to work for low wages. In 1798, there was a failed rebellion in Ireland, which led to the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And this made it possible for many of the poor Irish people to move to Manchester to look for jobs. So with the end of the wars, prices were down, but the use of machines increased, and the ability to have poor workers work for lower wages was possible. This cartoon depicts that the economic problems of the period after the end of the wars with France, and these problems were for all classes. So in this cartoon, before the war, John Bull, the depiction of England, is fat and healthy and happy because he has a lot of food and the economy is doing very well. During the war, he's getting skinnier because the economy is suffering a little bit, but it's really after the war, when there's peace with all the world, that John Bull is really suffering and has become very thin and poor. So the end of the wars in 1815 did lead to economic problems for all social classes. And as we've seen this with the merchants, with demand falling, prices falling, profits falling, and their attempts to save costs with machines. Irish immigrants. They also tried to save costs by reducing hand production, particularly by lowering wages for weavers and spinsters, and maybe even closing businesses. Of course, this led to problems for weavers and spinsters. As their wages fell, as they had less work, they were suffering more and more, and this is why their solution was machine breaking Luddite raids. But it's important to realize also that aristocrats were not doing particularly well at this time period either. They also were losing profit. The problem is that the demand for the grain that was grown on the land that they owned had declined with free trade and with competition from cheaper foreign grains, which was known as corn at this time period. Aristocrats made money by collecting rent from agricultural workers who now were making less money because they're selling less grains. So aristocrats had to lower the rent that they were collecting or they weren't going to get any money. So this meant that their profits fell. And they too had to come up with a solution. And their solution was to pass laws in Parliament that helped themselves and their class. The aristocrats could rely on the government to help them because they controlled the government. Britain was a limited or constitutional monarchy in which the monarch has to rule with representatives of the people. But it was an oligarchy, not a democracy. There was a House of Lords, the upper house, that could veto the lower house, and it was made up of about 160 hereditary peers, the top of the aristocracy, the eldest son in the family of peers. The lower House of Commons was elected, but by very few people. There were property qualifications to vote, and even higher property qualifications to serve as the member of Parliament. This meant that only the aristocrats and the very wealthy were able to vote for parliament, and even less could become members of parliament. So it was the aristocracy that controlled the government. This is why in our game only aristocrats can vote in town hall. And in our game, our Manchester aristocrats can pass laws for the entire British nation. This is a counterfactual for game purposes. We are supposing in our game that Parliament in London has asked Manchester aristocrats to make decisions about the new industrial economy and its consequences because they know more about them than anyone else. Of course, this wasn't the case in real life, but for game purposes and to illustrate how the aristocrats had control over the government at this time, our aristocrats are the only ones who can vote, and they can vote on laws for the entire country. Aristocrats in the British government were having another economic problem when the wars with France ended, and this problem's for the government itself. To pay for the French wars, the British government had racked up a huge debt. It had more than tripled in the course of the wars until by 1818, when our game is in session, 2/3 of the total government expenditure was paid on the interest of the national debt. What this meant is that the government had to raise taxes throughout the war. They imposed a new direct tax in 1798, which was an income tax that was graduated. The poor didn't pay it, the middle classes paid less than the very rich, and the aristocrats paid the most. But the government also raised indirect taxes on hundreds of different goods. In fact, indirect taxes increased 4 times over the course of the war, and the British people were very much concerned about taxes kept going up. When the wars were over, the aristocracy and Parliament did a few things that seemed very self-serving to many in the rest of the country. The government seemed to favor aristocrats, not workers or business owners. One thing they did was to abolish the income tax, which hit them the most, and they raised indirect taxes to make up for the loss of income. They also passed the Corn Laws, which were a tariff or a tax on foreign grain that were like an indirect tax because they were passed on to goods in the form of the bread that was made from the grain. There's more about the Corn Laws in the game book, but briefly, the Corn Laws affected what the British called corn. This was grain that could be ground, such as wheat, rye, malt, oats, and then made into items that were eaten or drunk, like bread, beer, or oatmeal. To encourage the purchase of high-priced British grain and to keep the price of British grain high, these laws discouraged people from buying cheaper foreign grain. And this was in order to make sure that the aristocrats could keep the rents high on the farmers who grew that grain. So what the laws said that if the price of grain fell too low, a tariff or a tax would be imposed on the cheap foreign grain, or in some cases it was prohibited from being imported into Britain altogether. And what this did is it made foreign grain more expensive so that the British people would buy British grain and the aristocrats would make more money. Another way to explain the Corn Laws is with a visual illustration. So if foreign grain, like French grain, is cheaper than British, say it sells for 2 shillings, and the British grain sells for 5 shillings, if there are no Corn Laws, the French grain will come into Britain, and the British people will buy the French grain because it's 2 shillings, and the British grain won't be sold at all unless the farmers and the aristocrats lower prices. But with the Corn Laws, if a tariff of, say, 4 shilling is imposed on imported grain, the 2 shilling cheap foreign grain will either not be sold in Britain at all, or those 4 shillings will be added to the foreign grain so that the foreign grain is 6 shillings in Britain, and of course everybody is going to buy the cheaper British grain and keep the profits of aristocrats high. So what this does is it makes the price to sell grain higher, which increases the profit of landlords. But what it also does is make the goods that are made out of that grain, like bread, more expensive. So the price of bread with the corn laws will be higher in Britain than it is in France. This is bad for workers who eat a great deal of bread, but it's also bad for employers who have to raise the wages they pay their workers so that their workers can survive. So, with the end of the wars in 1815, the government did things that some people really didn't think helped all of the population. They abolished the income tax, which was paid mostly by the rich on property and income. They raised indirect taxes, like sales taxes on necessities like candles, clothing, soap, also on luxury goods. And they imposed foreign tariffs, like the corn laws, that kept the price of British grain high, but also kept the price of bread high. And these indirect taxes are paid mostly by the lower and the middle classes. So the results are that the rich paid less in tax, whereas everyone else paid more after the wars with France were over. As this chart shows, the changes in direct and indirect taxes, after 1815, direct taxes fell by almost a third, whereas indirect taxes increased significantly. So it does seem that the government is favoring aristocrats, not workers or business owners. So when our game begins, the aristocrats have found a way to do better, get more profit, and pay less taxes. Workers in hand production are suffering significantly with lower wages, less employment, and higher expenses on consumer goods and food. The middle classes were kind of mixed, a little bit confused. They had some problems with lower demand, competition from European textile producers with free trade. So the prices for textiles went down and their profits were lower. They also were paying more in indirect taxes. On the other hand, they also don't have to pay the income or property tax. They can pay their workers lower wages. There are exciting new inventions that can maximize production, and there's an influx of cheaper Irish workers that they can employ. And yet there's one other thing for the new middle class merchants that they did have to worry about. And this is that the workers, especially in the new factories, were continually thinking of new ways to make their lives better at the expense of their employer. While hand workers relied on the traditional negotiation of riot of the Luddites who destroyed machines and factories, factory workers had discovered another tactic, withholding their labor through strikes. In the year our game is set in Manchester, textile workers began to use strikes to get their wages increased, as this article from the Times of London illustrates. In the summer of 1818, which is when our game ends, the cotton spinners of Manchester have refused to work, and they are using collective action against their employers to try to get the employers to give in and raise their wages. They paraded on the streets, trying to get other workers to join them and to go out on strike. This was shocking to many in the middle and upper classes because this protest was in public, not at night in disguise, and it advertised the strength of the numbers of the factory workers. The strikes in the summer of 1818 in Manchester were quite large, as this radical publication indicated. In Manchester, that says there are like 12,000 cotton spinners and dyers have refused to follow their work, and later that number grew. Many business owners and the government officials were very worried about this new tactic. But workers throughout the region and as far away as London, where this newspaper is published, were interested and sympathetic. This report makes many arguments for why the strikers are justified, that they're just trying to recover the necessary comforts that were taken away from them by business owners during a period of economic difficulty, and never given back. And so the idea of strikes spread and increased in this time period. The strikes were not successful in the end, and now we're getting beyond the period of our game, which is from December 1817 to July of 1818. But what you can see from this account in September is that the immense numbers, 20 to 30,000 weavers, had gone on strike, and now they have returned to work, and they have promised not to combine again. Their leaders also were put in jail under the Combination Acts and unions made illegal. They all knew they were breaking the law, but they still went on strike. The action of the aristocrats and desperation of the workers led many in the middle and lower classes to decide that the only way to help themselves and their class economically was through politics. They had to get themselves into the government that made the laws. As we have seen, not that many people in Britain could vote at this time, especially in a county election like the ones held in Manchester. There was quite a high property qualification to vote and a much higher one to run. This is why the aristocrats usually controlled the elections. They were the vast majority voting, and they could pay off electors in the way that to vote in the way they wanted. Frequently, elections were not contested. The most powerful local aristocrat, who often sat in the House of Lords, simply chose who would run for election. Often it would be one of his relatives. At the time of our game, an increasing number of middle class and working class people thought that Parliament and its voting system had to be reformed because it had done such a bad job under the aristocracy. This drawing is from one of them. The formerly noble, fat, and jolly John Bull, a depiction of England, has become a skeleton, and he's being killed by the arrows of the mistakes made by Parliament, including the national debt and high taxes, the Corn Laws, which are the mortal stroke, lost liberties, despotism, and tyranny. But coming out of the mouth of the skeleton is the phrase, "I shall arise again." And clearly, a reform of Parliament is what would bring John Bull back to health. These sentiments were organized into a reform movement by some key middle class leaders, like Henry Hunt, William Cobbett, Major John Cartwright. They traveled the country giving speeches and making demands for reforms. Their demands were radical. They didn't just want the middle classes to vote, they wanted all men to vote. They wanted a secret ballot so that the votes were fair. They wanted payment of members of parliament so that even the working class people or middle class people who had to work could sit in parliament. And they wanted the seats redistributed so that the aristocracy didn't have control of districts with very few people, but also so that cities like Manchester could have their own representatives. These reform leaders used a number of tactics that were popular with the middle classes and the working classes. So one of their tactics was to have mass meetings where tens of thousands of people would gather to hear their speeches. They also had petitions, both to Parliament and to the Prince Regent, where thousands of people would sign the petition. At the same time, clubs and societies formed throughout the country, and even women became involved, especially in the region around Manchester, with their own female reform society. They were not asking for women to have the right to vote. They were merely asking for universal male suffrage. But in the back of their minds could have been the thought that if all the men could vote, then maybe the vote could be extended to women. There were also many political newspapers. Cobbett had one of his own, but by the time of our game, there were some very new, very radical political publications that were read widely in Manchester, even though they were published in London, and they were read by the working class. Even the working class who couldn't read could have them read to them in their local pub. They can be gotten on Hathi Trust these days if you want to see them. More conservative players can read the London Times, which gives a conservative point of view. And while the working classes and middle classes wanted political reform, there were many people in Britain who were very much afraid of it. This was true of most of the aristocracy, but also many in the middle classes, including owners of textile businesses and factories. And their main fear was that radical reform would bring the ideas of the French Revolution back and spread them to England. The French King Louis XVI had been executed just 25 years before our game begins, and the Reign of Terror was not a distant memory. There was a sense that any demand for changing the British political system would end spiraling into complete change of all politics and societies, including kings and aristocrats and the church. This is why this cartoon about radical reform, which is probably depicting Henry Hunt giving a speech, depicts the radical reformers as either pigs or monkeys. They are dangerous animals. Here in this cartoon, Henry Hunt is riding on a devil, followed by other demons, carrying the cap of liberty of the French Revolution and being inspired by Napoleon in the background. He's riding a devil, and he's bringing Thomas Paine and also the ideas of the American Revolution to Britain. Also is a banner of the Black Dwarf, the radical newspaper that we know was quite popular in Britain. Yet again, here's another cartoon of radical reform, and the skeleton hiding behind the face of reform is wearing the French Revolutionary cap of liberty. And in the banners of the demons that are following him are the words murder, robbery, starvation, slavery, blasphemy. Because of this intense fear of radical reform, the government took serious actions. They suspended habeas corpus, which means that people could be arrested based on suspicion of supporting revolution alone. And again, the government did have an extensive spy network to flush out radicals who might be seditious. Seditious meetings, like those of Hunt and Cobbett, could be banned, and those who organized them or spoke at them could be arrested. And editors of dangerous pamphlets and newspapers like the Gorgon or Black Dwarf could be arrested and their publications banned. The government was convinced they had to do this because they thought a revolution was imminent. A secret committee of Parliament had investigated and concluded in the year of our game, 1817, that there were secret societies called Spensians that were planning what was basically a communist revolution under the guise of radical political reform. They wanted to overthrow the government and take property away from the aristocrats and wealthy business owners and divide it among the poor. They were only partially correct. There was such a Spensian society that met to discuss the ideas of radical Thomas Spence, and that had plotted a small and failed rebellion in 1816. The Spensians even issued coins to spread the ideas of Spence, and with mottos about the importance of independence over slavery, acting like a cat, instead of gratitude and obedience like a dog. The radical newspaper, the Black Dwarf, was aware of this secret report and of the fear of revolution, but they thought it was exaggerated. And in fact, what they thought was that it was a pretext for the government to suspend habeas corpus in order to create a despotism. The Black Dwarf argued that claims of potential rebellion was being used as a justification to impose tyranny and oppose any changes that would take power away from the aristocracy. What all of this does indicate is how far apart many people were at the time in their political beliefs, but also how fearful they were about the future, both politically and economically, because of the new technology. And this should make it clear how familiar this period should be today. At a time when there's a great deal of political division, as well as some technology that holds great potential for the future, but also can be quite frightening, we are living in a difficult period of transition. So that should be enough historical background to begin playing the game Engines of Mischief. There is another video explaining the rules of the game that can be consulted by instructors and players, and also some videos about arguments that players can make during the game. Good luck.